The Galactic Academy's xenobiology classroom was a marvel of interspecies engineering. Floating holographic displays, atmospheric processors for different breathing requirements, and seating that could accommodate everything from crystalline rock beings to gaseous cloud entities. It was the kind of place where you could learn about the universe's most fascinating creatures, while sitting next to one. Professor Clank adjusted his four mechanical arms with the precise irritation of someone who had been teaching for 3 centuries and was beginning to question his life choices. His chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the artificial lights as he surveyed his class of 17 students from across the galaxy. There was Blobo, a gelatinous mass from the Andromeda Spiral who communicated through color changes and smelled faintly of vanilla. Next to him sat Razor, a crystalline being whose species had evolved from living minerals and who made tiny chiming sounds when he moved. In the back row, Fluffington, a 6-legged mammalian creature covered in what looked like purple cotton candy, was already taking notes with all 6 appendages. "Today, class," Professor Clank announced, his voice carrying the metallic undertone common to his species, "we will be examining the apex predators of Sol 3, also known as Earth. This should provide excellent insight into evolutionary adaptation and survival mechanisms." The students murmured with interest. Earth was something of a legendary planet in certain academic circles, known for its biodiversity and the peculiar habit of producing species that seemed designed by a committee of sadists. That's when the classroom door burst open with the subtle grace of a small explosion. "Sorry I'm late, Professor. The cafeteria was serving those little blue cube things again, and I had to make sure they weren't trying to poison us." Jake Henderson stumbled in, his backpack catching on the doorframe, sending a cascade of papers and what appeared to be several energy bar wrappers across the floor. He was human, which meant he looked like every other human, unremarkable and soft, and completely incapable of surviving in any reasonable environment. His brown hair was disheveled, his clothes were wrinkled, and he moved with the casual confidence of someone who had never met a dangerous situation he couldn't accidentally stumble through. The class watched in fascination as Jake somehow managed to trip over his own feet while walking to his seat, knock over Blobo's hydration unit, and apologize profusely while making the situation worse by trying to clean up the spill with his sleeve. "Mr. Henderson," Professor Clank said, his voice carrying 3 centuries of barely contained patience, "how kind of you to join us. We were just about to begin our study of your planet's apex predators." "Oh, cool." Jake dropped into his seat, which was unfortunately positioned right in front of Razor, who had been peacefully meditating. The impact sent crystalline chimes throughout the room. "Are we watching the good stuff? Like, the really scary monsters?" Professor Clank's compound eyes focused on Jake with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly annoying puzzle. "Indeed. I trust you'll find the material educational." Jake grinned, completely oblivious to the fact that every other student in the room was now staring at him with the kind of morbid curiosity usually reserved for traffic accidents. "This is going to be great. I love nature documentaries." The irony, of course, was completely lost on him. Professor Clank activated the holographic display with a flourish that would have been impressive if his species hadn't evolved to make every gesture look like a mechanical ballet. The classroom dimmed, and suddenly they were all staring at what appeared to be an endless blue void. "Earth's oceans," Professor Clank announced, "covering 71% of the planet's surface and home to some of the most terrifying predators in known space." The first creature materialized in the hologram, and half the class immediately recoiled. It was massive, gray, and moved through the water with the fluid grace of impending doom. Rows of triangular teeth gleamed in its mouth like nature's own chainsaw. "The great white shark," Professor Clank continued, clearly enjoying the horrified gasps from his students. "Apex predator of Earth's marine environments. Length up to 20 feet. Weight up to 5,000 pounds. Bite force 4,000 pounds per square inch." Blobo turned a sickly shade of green and made a sound like a deflating balloon. Razor's crystalline structure actually cracked slightly from stress. Fluffington had covered 4 of his 6 eyes with his appendages. "Hey, Bruce," Jake said cheerfully, leaning forward in his seat. "Man, I haven't seen a great white since my cousin's wedding in Australia. Beautiful animals. Really misunderstood, you know." The entire class turned to stare at Jake as if he had just casually mentioned dancing with supernovas. "You have encountered these creatures?" Professor Clank asked, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to determine if his student was insane or suicidal. "Well, yeah, I mean, not like personally, but I've been diving with them a few times. They're actually pretty chill once you know what you're doing. Just don't splash around like a wounded seal and you're fine." The hologram shifted to show a massive feline creature with a golden mane, stalking through tall grass with predatory focus. The African lion, Professor Clank announced. Pack hunter, territorial, capable of taking down prey many times its size. Simba! Jake exclaimed with genuine delight. Oh man, these guys are awesome. Did you know they can sleep up to 20 hours a day? Goals, am I right? Fluffington made a sound that could only be described as a whimper. Sleep, 20 hours, and then hunt for 4? Pretty much. Though honestly, it's usually the females who do most of the hunting. The males are basically just there for intimidation and looking majestic. Kinda like my dad at barbecues. The next creature was even worse. A massive brown bear rearing up on its hind legs, claws extended, mouth open to reveal teeth that belonged in nightmares. The grizzly bear, Professor Clank said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was an ominous whisper. Omnivorous, territorial, and capable of running 35 miles per hour. Oh, those guys, Jake said, nodding appreciatively. Yeah, you definitely want to respect their space, though most of the time they're just trying to find berries and fish. We had one that kept getting into our garbage when I was a kid. Mom named him Gerald, sweet guy, terrible table manners. Lobo had now turned completely transparent, which was apparently his species' equivalent of fainting. Razor was making soft chiming sounds that suggested he was praying to whatever gods crystalline beings believed in. Your mother named the predator? Professor Clank asked weakly. Well, yeah. Can't just call him Hey Bear forever, right? That's just rude. The hologram cycled through more creatures. A massive saltwater crocodile that made the class collectively shudder. A Siberian tiger that prowled with deadly grace. A polar bear that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought regular bears weren't terrifying enough. To each one, Jake responded with the casual familiarity of someone discussing old friends. Oh, salties are grumpy. Tigers are gorgeous, but you definitely don't want to surprise one. And polar bears? Man, they're basically the ocean's version of a grizzly, but with less patience and more attitude. By the time the display showed a pack of wolves hunting in perfect coordination, most of the class was hiding under their desks. Jake, meanwhile, was practically bouncing in his seat with enthusiasm. Wolves. These guys are incredible. Perfect pack hunters, amazing family structure, and they're basically where we got dogs from. My neighbor has a husky mix that's like 70% wolf. Sweetest thing you've ever seen, but she'll steal your socks if you're not watching. Professor Clank stood frozen, his forearms hanging limply at his sides, as his carefully planned lesson on apex predators slowly transformed into a casual chat about Jake's apparently suicidal lifestyle choices. The hologram flickered and changed to something that made even Jake pause. 8 legs, multiple eyes, and fangs that dripped with what the narrator helpfully identified as neurotoxic venom. The creature hung suspended in what appeared to be a corner, waiting with the patience of something that had turned waiting into an art form. The funnel-web spider, Professor Clank announced, his voice barely above a whisper. One of Earth's most venomous arachnids. A single bite can kill a human in 15 minutes. The class had gone completely silent. Even the atmospheric processors seemed to be holding their breath. Oh man, Jake said, and for the first time since the documentary started, his voice carried something other than casual enthusiasm. That brings back memories. Every alien eye in the room focused on him with laser intensity. I had one of these guys living under my bed when I was 7. Used to wake up and see him just hanging out there, you know? My mom kept saying she'd call an exterminator, but I kinda got attached to him. Named him Fred. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for moments right before explosions or mass hysteria. You had one of these creatures as a pet? Razor managed to chime out, his crystalline structure vibrating with what could only be described as existential terror. Well, not exactly a pet, more like a roommate who didn't pay rent. Fred was pretty chill, actually. He'd catch the mosquitoes and flies, I'd leave him alone. Mutual respect, you know. Though I'll admit, the first time I saw him, I did scream loud enough to wake the neighbors. The hologram shifted to show a massive python coiled around a tree branch, its scales glistening in dappled sunlight. The reticulated python, Professor Clank continued, though his voice was becoming increasingly strained, capable of swallowing prey as large as deer whole. Oh, noodles, Jake exclaimed, brightening immediately. Not that exact one, obviously, but my Uncle Rick had a python named Noodles. Sweetest snake you'd ever meet. Used to wrap around my shoulders when I was little and just hang out while I watched TV. Mom was not a fan. Fluffington made a sound like a tea kettle reaching critical pressure. It wrapped around your shoulders, your neck area, where your breathing happens. Yeah, but like, in a friendly way. Noodles was just being affectionate. Snakes are basically scaly puppies once you get to know them. The documentary continued its parade of horrors. A black widow spider, which Jake remembered fondly as the one that lived in our garage and kept the place pest-free. A king cobra, which reminded him of a zoo visit where he'd been super impressed by how polite it was during feeding time. A massive anaconda, which brought up memories of a nature documentary he'd watched while eating cereal. Each of these creatures represents millions of years of evolutionary perfection, Professor Clank said, though he was starting to sound less like an educator and more like someone trying to convince himself that reality still made sense. They are designed to hunt, to kill, to survive, in the most hostile environments imaginable. I mean, yeah, Jake agreed, nodding seriously, but they're also just trying to live their lives, you know? Like, Fred wasn't under my bed because he wanted to murder me. He was there because it was dark and quiet and probably had fewer vibrations than the rest of the house. Smart guy, really. If I could have fit under there, I probably would have joined him. The hologram showed a scorpion, its tail arched in the classic striking position, venom glistening on its stinger. Desert scorpion, Professor Clank announced weakly, capable of surviving for months without food or water, and its sting can cause paralysis and death. Oh, these guys are everywhere back home, Jake said cheerfully. You learn to shake out your shoes before putting them on, though honestly, most of the time they're more scared of you than you are of them. Except for that one time, when I was 12 and found a whole family of them in my sleeping bag during a camping trip. That was educational. Blobo had now turned completely black, which his species only did in the face of imminent death. Razor was making sounds like wind chimes in a hurricane. Fluffington had somehow managed to tie his appendages in knots. Your sleeping bag? Professor Clank asked, his voice barely audible. Yeah, I'd forgotten to zip it up. Lesson learned. Though, I'll give them credit, they were very organized about it. Mama scorpion, Papa scorpion, and like 6 little baby scorpions all lined up in a row. It was almost cute, if you ignored the whole deadly neurotoxin thing. Jake paused, looking around at his classmates with genuine concern. Hey, are you guys okay? You all look kinda freaked out. It's just nature documentary stuff, right? The terrible realization was beginning to dawn on the class. These weren't Jake's apex predators. These were Jake's childhood neighbors. Professor Clank shut off the holographic display with a sharp gesture, plunging the classroom into normal lighting. The sudden brightness made everyone blink, except for Jake, who just looked around with the confused expression of someone who had missed the memo about the impending apocalypse. Mr. Henderson, Professor Clank said, his voice carrying the careful control of someone trying very hard not to lose what remained of his sanity. I need you to explain something to me. Sure thing, Professor. What's up? These creatures we have just observed represent some of the most efficient killing machines in known space. They are studied across the galaxy as examples of evolutionary perfection in the art of predation. And you are telling me that you lived with them? Jake scratched his head, which was apparently a human gesture for thinking. Well, not like roommates or anything, more like neighbors? I mean, they were there, we were there, everybody just kind of figured out how to coexist. Coexist, Professor Clank repeated slowly, as if the word was foreign to him, which, considering his species had evolved on a planet where the most dangerous creature was a mildly irritable moss, it basically was. Yeah, like you learn the rules, you know? Don't surprise a bear, don't corner a snake, shake out your shoes, check your sleeping bag, swim in groups during shark season, basic stuff. Razor made a sound like crystal wind chimes having a nervous breakdown. Shock season? Oh, right. You guys probably don't have migration patterns like that. Yeah, certain times of year, certain beaches, you get more shark activity. But it's not like they're actively hunting humans. We're not really on their menu. Wrong texture, not enough fat content, weird bone structure. We're basically junk food to them. You speak as if you have studied their dietary preferences, Professor Clank said, his compound eyes narrowing. Well, I mean, you kinda have to if you're gonna share the ocean with them. Plus, marine biology was my minor in college. The class stared at him. Blobo had turned a color that didn't exist in most species' visual spectrums. You're minor, Fluffington whispered, his voice barely audible through his 6 layers of terror. You studied these creatures for fun? Yeah, it was actually really interesting. Did you know that more people are killed by vending machines than sharks every year? Humans are way more dangerous to sharks than they are to us. We've got this whole conservation thing going on now to protect them. Protect them? Professor Clank's voice went up an octave. From what? From us, mostly. Humans are, well, we're pretty good at the whole survival thing, maybe too good sometimes. There was a long pause as this information sank in. Then Razor asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What do you mean by too good? Jake's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time since he'd walked into the classroom, he seemed to really consider his words. Well, I mean, we're omnivores, right? We can eat basically anything. We can survive in almost any climate. We're persistence hunters, so we can literally just chase things until they die of exhaustion. We're tool users, problem solvers, pattern recognizers. We adapt really quickly to new situations. And Professor Clank prompted. And we're really, really good at killing things. Like, scary good. We've driven dozens of species extinct just by accident. When we actually tried to eliminate something, Jake shrugged. Well, let's just say there's a reason we're working so hard on conservation now. The classroom was dead silent. Even the atmospheric processors seemed to have stopped humming. You are saying, Professor Clank said slowly, that humans are more dangerous than these apex predators? Oh, absolutely. I mean, have you seen our history? We've been fighting each other for thousands of years and we've gotten really creative about it. Wars, weapons, tactics, strategy. We're basically the apex predator that got bored with hunting animals and started hunting each other instead. Jake looked around at the horrified faces of his classmates and seemed to finally realize he might have said something concerning. But we're totally cool now, he added quickly. I mean, mostly. We've got laws and stuff, and we're way more interested in exploring space and making friends with aliens than conquering anybody. That's why I'm here, right? Cultural exchange and all that? Professor Clank's forearms began to tremble slightly. Mr. Henderson, are you telling me that your entire species consists of apex predators who have moved beyond hunting for survival and now engage in combat for entertainment? Well, when you put it like that, it sounds way more ominous than it actually is. The silence that followed suggested that maybe, just maybe, it was exactly as ominous as it sounded. Professor Clank was making a sound that his species typically reserved for impending molt cycles or existential crises. His forearms were now trembling visibly, and his compound eyes had taken on the glassy sheen of someone whose worldview had just been fed through a meat grinder. Perhaps, he said, in a voice that suggested he was desperately hoping to be wrong, you could demonstrate some of these human abilities you mentioned. Jake brightened immediately, because apparently the concept of reading a room was not covered in human survival training. Oh, sure. What do you want to see? Well, you mentioned pattern recognition and problem solving. Oh, that's easy stuff. Jake stood up and walked to the front of the class, somehow managing to look completely non-threatening, despite the fact that every alien in the room was now eyeing him like he might spontaneously combust into violence. See, human brains are basically pattern-matching machines. We're constantly looking for connections, threats, opportunities, escape routes. He gestured around the classroom. Like right now, I can tell you that Blobo is scared because he's gone transparent, which means his species probably uses color changes for communication. Razor is making those chiming sounds, which suggests stress vocalizations. Fluffington has tied his appendages in knots, which is probably a defensive posture. The class stared at him. Jake had just casually analyzed their emotional states, using observational skills they hadn't even realized he possessed. You have been studying us, Professor Clank asked weakly. Not studying, exactly. Just watching. It's automatic. Humans are social creatures, so we're hardwired to read body language, voice patterns, environmental cues. It's how we survived before we developed language. What else can you observe? Razor chimed nervously. Jake tilted his head and suddenly his casual demeanor shifted into something more focused. Well, Professor Clank, your species is insectoid, probably evolved from a hive structure based on your social behaviors and the way you organize information. You're stressed right now because your antennae are twitching in a specific pattern and you keep adjusting your arms, which suggests you're fighting instinctive defensive postures. Professor Clank's antenna immediately stopped twitching. Lubo, your species is probably aquatic or semi-aquatic, given your hydration requirements and the way you move. You're a prey species, aren't you? That's why you go transparent when scared. Camouflage reflex. Lobo turned completely invisible. And Fluffington, you're definitely a pack animal. You keep looking to the others for social cues, and your position so you can see all the exits. Smart. The silence in the room was deafening. Oh, and you mentioned healing and immune systems, Jake continued, apparently oblivious to the growing horror on everyone's faces. That's pretty straightforward, too. He pulled out a small knife from his backpack, which caused half the class to dive under their desks. Whoa, hey, it's just a utility knife, Jake said quickly. I'm not going to hurt anyone, I was just going to show you how human healing works. Before anyone could stop him, Jake made a small cut on his finger. The aliens watched in fascination and horror as a drop of bright red blood welled up. See, human blood carries white cells that immediately rush to any injury site. They fight off infection, start the clotting process, and begin tissue repair. Plus, our blood is full of iron, which is why it's red. Most species can't process iron like we can. As they watched, the tiny cut began to close almost immediately. Our immune systems are basically biological warfare units, Jake continued cheerfully. We're constantly fighting off viruses, bacteria, parasites, toxins. Most of the stuff that would kill other species, we just shrug off. Food poisoning, radiation, temperature extremes, atmospheric pressure changes. You fight off toxins? Professor Clank asked faintly. Oh yeah, all the time. Alcohol is technically a poison, but we drink it for fun. Caffeine is a neurotoxin, but we use it to wake up. Capsaicin, the stuff that makes peppers hot, is a chemical weapon, but we put it on our food because we like the way it burns. Jake paused, looking thoughtful. Actually, now that I think about it, most human cuisine is basically an exercise in consuming things that should probably kill us. We eat fermented vegetables, aged dairy products, raw fish, moldy cheese. Oh, and chocolate is toxic to most earth animals, but we love it. What about the persistence hunting you mentioned? Razor asked, his voice barely a whisper. Oh, that's the really cool one. Jake's eyes lit up. See, humans aren't the fastest or strongest predators, but we're incredibly efficient. We can run for hours without stopping. We sweat to cool down instead of panting, so we don't have to stop to regulate temperature. We can track prey across vast distances, and we can coordinate as a group to corner things. Jake started pacing around the room, his movements suddenly taking on a different quality. Where before he had seemed clumsy and harmless, now he moved with the fluid efficiency of something designed for pursuit. The thing is, most animals can sprint really fast, but they can't maintain it, so humans would just follow them. For hours, for days if necessary, just walking, jogging, tracking, never stopping, never giving up. Eventually the prey would collapse from exhaustion, and then, Jake shrugged, dinner. You would chase them until they died of fear and exhaustion? Fluffington whispered. Pretty much. Though we prefer to call it persistence hunting. Sounds less terrifying. The class was now looking at Jake with the kind of expression usually reserved for incoming asteroids, or incoming asteroids. And you mentioned warfare, Professor Clank said, though his voice suggested he really didn't want to know the answer. Jake's expression grew more serious. Yeah, humans are. We're really good at organized violence. We've been doing it for thousands of years. Strategy, tactics, weapons development, psychological warfare. We turned fighting into an art form. Then a science. Then an industry. He paused, looking around at the terrified faces of his classmates. But like I said, we're mostly past that now. We're more interested in exploring and learning than conquering. That's why programs like this exist, right? To prove that humans can be peaceful. The irony of this statement, delivered by someone who had just casually demonstrated multiple apex predator abilities while his alien classmates cowered in terror, was apparently lost on everyone except the universe itself, which seemed to be having a good laugh at the whole situation. The class bell chimed, its cheerful electronic melody cutting through the atmosphere of existential dread like a knife through butter. Jake immediately started packing up his backpack, with the same chaotic energy he'd brought to everything else that day. Well, that was fun, he announced, shoving papers and energy bar wrappers into his bag with complete disregard for organization. Same time Thursday, Professor? Professor Clank stood frozen at the front of the classroom, his forearms hanging limply at his sides, staring at Jake as if he were watching a friendly neighborhood nuclear weapon pack up its lunch. Mr. Henderson, he said slowly, before you go, I have one final question. Sure thing, shoot. The poor choice of words made half the class flinch. If humans are, as you have demonstrated, apex predators of remarkable efficiency, why are you here? Why join a galactic community? Why not simply conquer it? Jake paused in his packing and looked genuinely confused by the question. Why would we want to do that? Because you could? I mean, I could probably eat nothing but pizza for the rest of my life too, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea. Jake slung his backpack over his shoulder, somehow managing to knock over a chair in the process. The thing about being an apex predator is that you get to choose what you do with that power, and humans figured out a long time ago that cooperation is way more interesting than domination. He looked around at his classmates, who were all still staring at him with various expressions of terror and fascination. Plus, you guys are awesome. Blobo, your species color communication is incredible. I've been trying to learn it, but human eyes can't see half the spectrum you use. And Razor, the way your people process information through crystalline matrices is something we've been trying to figure out for decades. Fluffington, your species pack coordination techniques could revolutionize our understanding of group dynamics. The aliens exchanged glances. Jake was talking about their abilities with the same casual enthusiasm he'd shown for Earth's apex predators. You see, Jake continued, warming to his theme, humans learned something important about being apex predators. The real power isn't in being the strongest or the fastest or the most dangerous. It's in being curious, in wanting to learn and grow and explore, in making friends instead of enemies. He headed toward the door, then paused and turned back. Besides, if we just conquered everything, we'd miss out on all the cool stuff, like this class. I learned so much about xenobiology today, and I got to hang out with you guys, which is way more fun than, whatever the alternative would be. Jake waved cheerfully and walked out, leaving behind a classroom full of aliens who were having to completely reconsider their understanding of the universe. Professor Clank stood in the sudden silence, his compound eyes tracking the space where Jake had been. After a long moment, he walked to his desk and began making notes on his holographic display. "Note to self," he muttered, his voice carrying the shell-shocked tone of someone who had survived something that probably shouldn't have been survivable. "Revise curriculum. Add section on human socialization patterns. Emphasize that apex predator status does not necessarily correlate with aggressive expansion behavior." He paused, then added, "Also, request hazard pay." Professor Blobo had slowly begun to return to his normal blue-green color, though he was still translucent around the edges. "Professor," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone testing whether reality was still functioning properly, "are all humans like that?" "I'm beginning to suspect," Professor Clank replied, "that Jake Henderson may actually be one of the less dangerous examples of his species." This statement caused Razor to emit a sound like wind chimes in a tornado. "However," Professor Clank continued, pulling himself together with visible effort, "I think we can also conclude that humans have evolved beyond their predatory instincts towards something more collaborative. This Jake character seems genuinely interested in friendship and learning, despite his rather alarming capabilities." Fluffington untied 3 of his 6 knotted appendages. "So they're apex predators who chose to be friendly." "It would appear so." "That's actually kind of impressive," Razor chimed thoughtfully. "I mean, terrifying, but impressive." Professor Clank nodded slowly. "Indeed, though I think we can all agree that future interactions with humans should be approached with a healthy respect for their unique background." As the students filed out of the classroom, each lost in their own thoughts about the implications of sharing a galaxy with friendly apex predators, Professor Clank made one final note on his display. "Personal reminder, never, under any circumstances, ask a human student to demonstrate their harmless abilities again. Some knowledge is too dangerous for academic curiosity." He paused, then added, "Also, invest in better seating. If we're going to have more human students, we need furniture that can withstand their natural clumsiness." Outside in the hallway, Jake was already chatting animatedly with a group of students from his quantum mechanics class, apparently oblivious to the fact that his xenobiology classmates were now spreading the word throughout the academy that humans were basically the galaxy's most terrifying predators, disguised as enthusiastic exchange students. By the end of the week, Jake Henderson had become something of a legend at the Galactic Academy, not because he was particularly brilliant or talented, but because he represented something that most species had never encountered before. An apex predator who used his power to make friends instead of enemies. And if that wasn't the most human thing in the universe, nothing was.